explore the biggest questions of our time and get to know the people behind the science. This is Curiosity Meets Discovery, research talks from inside the Max Planck Society.
Every civilization has a framework of rules to ensure order. And anthropologists often look to these laws to understand a community's values. Until now, the act of governing was entirely people-based. But anytime there are people, there will inevitably be flaws. In an era marked by exceptional advancements in digital technology, anthropologists are now focusing on the incredible array of new tools that have exciting potential to minimize factors like fraud and corruption. Dr. Ursula Rao is director of the Department of Anthropology of Politics and Governance at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. Her work focuses on politics and governance in India and the role that technology plays in shaping policy, monitoring behavior, and enforcing governance. How will emerging technology impact the humanity of government interactions? What are the limitations of this technology, and is it truly free from bias? These are just a few of the questions we explore in today's episode. Ursula, welcome to Curiosity Meets Discovery.
I'm grateful for this wonderful opportunity to present our work at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle. I would like to speak about a project that I'm doing in my Department of Anthropology of Politics and Governance. And this is specifically a story of governance. And when we speak about governance as anthropologists, we usually take a case study approach. This means that we look at a particular case in total detail, from the politicians' end, what happened in parliament, the policy making, what are bureaucrats doing, what are technological staff doing, how does this translate into regulation and forms, and what is the experience of a client. And by taking this kind of 360-degree picture, we get an understanding of networks production of governance technology. And I would like to tell you, I give you an example today, an example from India, in order to tell you why we're doing this and how this is helping us understand better how governments work. Now, my example is about digital governance. There is much excitement about digital governance these days, and I've used two very current examples from the news that I found on the internet in order to show you some of the excitement it's generating. On the first example, you see something published in the journal or the newspaper Modern Diplomacy, and it is the celebration of World Standards Day 2021, which is celebrated on 14th October every year. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization is pleased to announce the launch of a brochure, Standards and Digital Transformation, Good Governance and the Digital Age. In other words, what you see here is, this is a direct quote from the news item, that not only is there an excitement about the possibility of what such digital governance might entail, but there are standards which would promote, and that's the hope, good governance. So in other words, very often digital governance is associated with fairness, transparency, efficiency, and also the freedom of corruption. This is something you see in the other article, which is specifically from India, and it was published in the Indian Express just recently on the 21st of October. And what you see here is Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, and he is announcing how the trust in technology will produce a networked reality in which there will be no longer any corruption in India. Now, this is a high aim, and it's a great aim. And now the question is, what actually does digital technology do when it hits the ground? So here I give you 4 pictures from India that I have taken during my research when I was looking at the various e-governing projects in India. Now you see a hand, it has a few scars, there is a fingerprinting machine, and there is a street-level bureaucrat sitting in front of a computer and a file. Now, when these utopian narratives, those narratives that dream about efficiency and a corruption-free administration, when they hit the ground, there is all kinds of friction. And these frictions are of all different sorts. There are, for example, bodies. The kind of biometric technology comes with a fiction that the body will always be the same. In other words, that your fingerprints will always be readable, that your iris scans will always easily be identifiable and identify you as a unique human being. But in real reality, we all know that bodies actually do change. Maybe the fingerprints don't change and the iris patterns don't change, but we age, our hair color changes, we have cuts, sometimes we have burns, there are calluses from hard labor on the farms, there is sometimes sweat in the summer. In winter, the fingers get really stiff, and very often biometric scanners and the real-life experience with them produces an inability of the machine to recognize your body. So your body hasn't changed fundamentally, but it has changed on its surface. And through this surface change, it becomes impossible to become visible to the machine. So there you are in front of the bureaucrat, and the bureaucrat is recognizing you, but the machine is not recognizing you. And in this case, then you cannot connect to the service to which you want to connect. There are other problems of discrimination. Technology is not as neutral as we sometimes believe. For example, it has been found that the way technology is configured, it is programmed so that darker bodies are hard to be recognized because the camera and the light and the way it's configured, it's suited for white bodies more than for darker bodies. Similarly, there are different fingerprints. Some people have fingerprints that are less steep in terms of the ridges on your fingers, and that means that they cannot be read so easily. There are other challenges, and you might have encountered some of them in your own life. That is, sometimes computers are extremely slow, they get old, there are network breakdowns, sometimes electricity fails, there are server capacity problems, there are electricity cuts, and there's, of course, the human factor. That has to do with constantly changing software and the inability of everyone to always kind of keep on top of the changing softwares that one has to operate in order to make these things work. There are other more hidden problems, and one of these problems are transparency. Now, transparency is a great idea, but transparency as a practice very often means that people higher up in the hierarchy can see more information, and people lower in the hierarchy or citizens can see less information. So transparency is not just a question of what kind of information is available, but also what kind of information is available to whom, and what is the effect of that information, having it or not having it, depending on the social position in which you are in. And these are some of the abstract problems, and my example, which I will give you later, will make some of them will illustrate some of them so that you understand how we can critique governance, but also how states can learn to implement e-governance better. Now, why India? My case study is located in India, and specifically I've done my own field work in the national capital of Delhi, which I've marked in this open source map with a red frame. Now, India as a capital of digital technology has lots to offer. Now, one of the big programs that India has and that makes it unique and the leader in the world is the Aadhaar program. Aadhaar is the Hindi word for foundation. And foundation it is because it is a foundational identity. Aadhaar is the biggest biometric database in the world. It captures over 1 billion residents of India, and it records the 10 fingerprints of every resident of India, the 2 iris scans, and attaches a 12-digit number to these biometric data, which is also attached to a few biographical data, so that every person can use the biometric identity to identify anywhere at any time with their body and can be recognized as the person they are. Now, this is a revolution, and no other country has implemented such a program at the scale. And the beauty about this program is that it is interoperable. We call it interoperable when it can be used for different types of services. Now, I'm giving you 2 examples here. One is the example, these are from logos from the different projects that the Indian government or state governments in India are implementing. One is called PDS. Now, PDS stands for Public Distribution System. It's a system by which poor people, those who live below the poverty line, can draw subsidized grains from fair price shops in order to feed their families. Now, when PDS is a notoriously leaky program, as they say. In other words, what happened in the past is that shopkeepers skimmed off some of the grains in order to sell it at a higher price in the private market, and thereby it would be lost to the actual consumer. And it would be a huge loss for the Indian state. Now, in order to make this program safe, now what's happening, by using the digital number, people can sign up with their fingerprint that they have received the grains, and this can be traced, and the shopkeeper will be the grains the shopkeeper received will be always in direct relation to the number of people who have biometrically signed up to have taken their grains. There's another program, and this I will speak about later. It's called PMJ. It is a health insurance. I will use the term national health insurance, and I will speak to you about all the details later as an illustration of how e-governance works in practice and how it needs to be improved. Now, India is not only the kind of biggest player in biometrics, but it's at the forefront of innovation in the way digital governance can be used to scale it out across a territory in which a substantial number of population has not been visible to the government because there were no ID cards before, and because lots of people live in villages, and villages often don't have enough government representatives to make sure that everyone is in the view of the government and receives the various services they need in order to survive or have a good health. And in order to improve this, digital governance is a chance, because you no longer need buildings of the government everywhere, but lots of these things can be done digitally now, and they can be done on the smartphone. And since most Indian users have mobile phones, although not all of them have smartphones, lots of these connections can happen now. So in other words, India is a country that needed governance. It is a country that's at the forefront of innovating. It has a highly skilled IT labor. It has direct connection through overseas Indians to Silicon Valley innovations, so that it is kind of one of the best case studies in which we can see, firstly, how you can do it, how you can do it at a scale, what might be the future of governance in Europe, and in fact, what might be the governance in other countries, because India, of course, is exporting this technology and expertise to other countries, also in the global south. Now, all this sounds wonderful, and it sounds like a really interesting road forward, although there are lots of voices who are critical, and you would have heard of concerns of privacy breach, of data security, data safety. In other words, lots of scholars, especially in security studies, have written about potential dangers that come with such digital governance. This is not my particular area of expertise, but my specific area of expertise is how does that work, and how does this promise translate into a practice, and what are the effects of this practice in everyday life? Now, I will give you 2 case studies of challenges, and then the question of how such challenges are addressed. So here is example 1. This is an old lady. She comes from the village, and we are in a city, in a town in India, where Mataji, this is what I'm calling here, Mataji is the respectful title for an old lady in India. So Mataji dresses up beautifully. She comes from the village. She travels 3 hours on the bus to find a station in which she can enroll biometrically into this database that I've already introduced to you. That's the Aadhaar database. She wants her fingerprints to be captured. She wants her irises to be scanned, and there are no problems with her irises. They get scanned easily, but her fingerprints are not at all readable. And this is because she's working with her hands manually under very difficult conditions in the fields, in the household. And with age, her fingerprints have just simply rubbed off. So the computer produces error after error after error. And it's very clear by the end of the day that she cannot be captured. And she walks away knowing that she is enrolled, but unaware of the fact that she will never receive her Aadhaar card. Now, the problem is that Aadhaar card had become an essential part of lots of applications for Social Security, for pension, for the public distribution system. So the question was, what would happen to Amma once all of these programs would make it necessary for her to identify biometrically? The second example is example of having to travel all the way through the big city of Delhi. Now, Delhi is a city in which the poor people tend to live at the fringes of the city, because that's where they can actually afford to live. Because rents or buildings in the inner city are too expensive. Now, Bapu wanted to sign up for digital health insurance. When he wanted to sign up, what happened is that he had heard that he could go to the next center, and the next center was not far away. It was 5 minutes walk. He went to the next center, and they said, but you're not from here. And he said, yeah, that's true. I'm from across Delhi, the other end of Delhi. This is where I have my house, and this is where I own the land. But it's here that I'm living, and here that I'm working, and here that I would like to enroll. And the bureaucrat says, no, you can't. You have to go to the place where you actually live. And he says, but I thought this was digital. I thought the data was available. But in fact, what had happened is that they chopped up the data in various databases in order to protect the security of this data, and thereby had placed it in different centers. And every person had to travel to the center where they were originally enrolled. So what happened to Bapu is that Bapu was told, you have to go to that place because for the security of your data, we could not bring it here. So Bapu had heard this, but being a daily laborer, he had to forego a day's income in order to sit on a bus, paying half of his income to travel on 4 different buses, taking about 3.5 hours to reach the point, the office at which his name would probably be there. So he entered the office, it was almost closing time, he was exhausted, it was a very hot day, and he came in and first sat down. And then the operator was very friendly. He came to him, he said, what do you want? He said, I want to enroll. He said, so please come up. And they asked, where's your family? And he said, I didn't bring my family. I wanted to enroll for the health insurance. But they said, a family is enrolled together on health insurance, and everyone's fingerprints have to be there so that later on at the hospital, you can identify with the fingerprint each of the patients which might need the health insurance later. And Bapu said, well, I didn't know, I've come alone. So then the operator said, well, I can enroll you alone, but then you can use the health insurance and your family can't use it. And so he said, well, what do I need to do for my family to use it? Well, they said, go back, bring your family and come again. And at that point, Bapu, of course, sighed because he had not earned on that day. He had spent money, he had spent lots of time. He knew he had to go back. And he was frustrated, he knew. And so he said, well, it might take 2 weeks for me to come back. And by that time, the enroller said, we don't know whether we'll be here in 4 weeks, because once we are in 2 weeks, because once we actually done with everyone here in this catchment area, we would close this shop. And by that time, Bapu was just frustrated and said, you just enroll me, and then I will use it, and then we'll see about the rest. So you see, in the real practice, things are more complicated. And it is now also that you might understand why it's necessary to look at such a system, not just from the point of view of one user or the bureaucrat or the policy, but we need to know what is technology doing, what is this kind of programmer doing, what is the bureaucrat doing, what is the client doing, what are each person's rationales, what are their challenges, and how do things become aligned in a way that they can actually function in somewhat smoothly. And now, as I was looking through the literature and doing my first set of articles that I've published on this, I looked at lots of challenges. But one of the articles, which you see in the middle, already has a subtitle, How to Make Fingerprinting Work in India. So in other words, more and more I got interested in the question of not so much where is it failing, but what are the procedures by which governments learn. And this is what my new book is about. My new book is about, telling us something about what are the processes by which governments can learn. And I would speak to you about this health insurance, which started as a health insurance called Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, or RSBY, and which was later translated into PMJ, which is the national health insurance wound up in the in a new iteration. And the health insurance was invented as a digital health insurance or a scheme born digital in 2008, and was then revamped 10 years later under the new government. And for this health insurance to work, the government had to learn over a whole long process of 60 years. So that my story about digital governance actually starts at the moment that India became independent. So it starts in just before 1947. And what happened in 1947, that India, as a newly independent country, was thinking about how are we going to secure the health of our population. And at that point, a commission had set and decided that what we needed was, in fact, a government clinics and government hospitals in order to offer free services to citizens. In other words, they designed what we call a supplier-side health system. But what happened is that the supplier-side investment in health could never catch up or never keep up, in fact, with the ambition and needs and desires of the country. So that more and more private clinics started, more and more private hospitals, and there was a growing, extensively growing and more quickly growing private market. And what happened then is that because in government hospitals people couldn't always get the services they wanted or they needed, or not at the level that they expected it, they started spending more and more money out of their own pocket. And this became imbalanced in such a way that, in fact, India's economy was growing, and every year lots of people were moving out of poverty. But because of what they call catastrophic health expenditure, for example, when there was a surgery in a family or a chronic illness or a mental illness, the family had to pool all their resources and was falling back into poverty. And this alerted policymakers, and they said, what can we do? What can we do in order to make sure that people get high quality services without having to pay on their own? And they started from the bottom of the pyramid, those people who had least. And when they did this, they realized that there's no way that the government could spend the extent it would need to ramp up government hospitals to a degree that you could actually kind of pay for all these services. So it was very clear that they had to recruit in the private market into this kind of service ecosystem. And in order to do this, they invented a health insurance. So in other words, learning how to connect the private and the public market in a program for universal health coverage was the first learning. Firstly, they had to learn that they had to do it, and then how they had to do it. And they started from the bottom pyramid, namely by making a health insurance that would be for the unorganized sector. Now, this is a totally new invention. An unorganized sector are those people who are not formally employed. Now, lots of us know employer-related insurances. Employer-related insurances are those that, in fact, are tied to your income and where you salary sacrifice parts of your salary in order to get then health insurance and maybe pay an extra bit on your own. Now, the unorganized sector are people who work in the informal economy, and they don't actually have an employer, and they don't have any regular income. They maybe have a small business. They maybe sell coconuts on the streets. So how do you do it? So what they then did in consultation with lots of different actors, the International Labour Organization, various health insurances, public health insurances, private health insurances, there's designed a program in which there would be pooling of risk among the poor and a policy that the state would pay, but which would then be delivered on a smart card in order that people could get cashless and paper-free service in private hospitals. Now, this was a wonderful program that worked initially badly, but then kind of, as, they were kind of trialing and testing the technology, it started working better. And my book traces 10 years of onboarding different stakeholders. Health insurances were not particularly keen on giving an insurance to poor people. It just didn't sound like something you could make a profit of. So they had to be convinced. Private hospitals had to be convinced that this health insurance, would, make it profitable for them to entertain very poor people. We're not particularly keen to have them. Everyone had to kind of learn how to use these digital devices. And this is very important, the state had to invent grievance mechanisms because I gave you lots of examples of grievances. Mediating those, mitigating those, people who could not enroll biometrically, how can they fill in a form, what are workarounds, the typical technical problems that occur. So this happened over a whole span of 10 years, and we can trace the communication. So basically what happened in India is that some states performed really well in this and others performed really badly. Now, as you're comparing these states, you see what are the things that the states learned which performed well in order to be able to deliver the service so that it actually reaches the people. Whereas in other cases, states did not learn the messages or didn't even hear them. How did this happen? Why did it happen? And what can we learn from this? And then finally, what became clear is that the health insurance itself, which is only for hospital treatment, would not cover for lots of illnesses that don't actually require you to go to a hospital. So in other words, one had to learn how one was linking this program specifically targeted at hospital treatment could be linked in with other necessary treatments, for example, for alternative medicine, for biomedical treatment that is just for small illnesses, preventive medicine, public services like clean water. This is what's going on right now, as much as what they need to do is to make sure that clinics are not making a profit of delivering unnecessarily expensive treatments when they are not needed, but refer people back to the lower clinic for cheaper treatment. And here digital governance is helping. So when in the initial cycle of learning, we had to learn how this even becomes accessible, how does everyone become literate, how is it made functional? What are the workarounds in case of problems? In the second iteration, what one now has to learn is how is one analyzing the data in such a way that, in fact, it can be used for fraud detection when a hospital stretching, they are not delivering the services that they expected to deliver, when hospitals are making a profit of unnecessary treatment. And in fact, digital data can give you a lot of information about this, but for this you need to program algorithms in the background. So what's going on right now at the center is a pooling of this kind of data and the generating of intelligent analysis for an understanding of the landscape of private clinics and how they are in relation to this health insurance. So to come to my final slide, what is it that I'm saying at a more abstract level? Now, basically what I'm saying is I'm showing how in situ and in concrete examples governments are learning. But this also has implications about the way we think about the state, because we tend to think about the state very often in two ways. We think states are static, they're always the same, or we think in terms of state in historical periods. So there's a post-war period, maybe a pre-war and a post-war period, or pre-independence and a post-independent period, or there is the contemporary neoliberal time. But in fact, states actually learn very slowly and across these critical moments that in some ways signal paradigmatic shifts, but don't bring them about. So what I'm proposing is to look at the process of internal learning as a way of paying attention to microtime and how states and shifting the way we think about the states as dynamic as opposed to static. And this also means to looking at transnational learning. So what is it that happens in international communication that makes states learn? And just as a warning, change does not necessarily always mean improvement. Now, I have told you a maybe rather optimistic story of how things have been improved, but in fact, every time you change someone, you advantage some people and you disadvantage others. So when you have a health insurance, you advantage the private market as opposed to maybe public players. And this might not necessarily be a good thing because you're pooling more resources into hospital care as opposed to clean water treatment or water treatment for clean water. So in other words, part of this analysis is looking at the consequences, also the unwanted consequences, and also the unpredicted consequences. And it means paying attention to the calibration of power relationships and who is gaining and who is winning with every change and every shift. in order to not fall trap to a simplistic narrative of that everything is always getting better. Because I think in your life, you too would have experienced that things get better and other things get worse. And so we must always pay attention to both things. I thank you a lot for your attention. I have spoken to you about one of the projects that's in the line techno-optimism. And the work at techno-optimism performs in kind of changing the way we do our governance. We have two other lines of inquiry in my department, and they're focused on well-being and health, or the good life. And there's a third one that focuses on ecological transformations, climate change, and resilience. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ursula, for that wonderful presentation. I was sitting here and I had a sense of optimism in the beginning, and then when you started, showing all the ways in which this has challenges, just like everything we do, I began to realize that I have the sense that with the digital revolution, we've been emphasizing all the gains. But what I walk away with here is the idea that we're not devoting enough time to make sure that they're operationally effective and efficient and delivering to the people in the way we want them to. I mean, I think it's, and speaking for myself, I get so excited about the digital technologies and what we can do now that we couldn't do before, that we forget that it's not just being able to do something new. It's being able to understand how being able to do that impacts people. And that's what I walked away from your talk with, really trying to understand how we bridge the technologies to the people. Is that fair?
Yeah, David, I think this is very, kind of good reaction, because it gives me also an opportunity to emphasize one more time that we are always talking about a heterogeneous set of people, right? We're talking about poor and rich. We're talking about educated and less educated. We're talking about literate and illiterate. We're talking about, farm laborers and urban executives. In other words, the kind of this art of paying attention means also art of paying attention to that diversity, because what might seem very easy from the headquarter in Delhi, where any bureaucrats will demonstrate this technology and it'll just be fantastic. But then you go to the village and you realize that, in fact, it's not fantastic. And then you see how some companies have learned that, in fact, the best technology has to be in the village and not in the headquarter, because in the village is the dust. In village, you have electricity cuts. In village, you have, not a very good signal. Whereas in the headquarter, they say, it's a cheap computer. If it's crappy, I just go around the corner and buy a new one. It doesn't matter. So in other words, when I speak about how we're learning, then it's also a question, how are those who are providing those services are actually paying attention to the fact that the world is not the world what they inhabit. Decision makers inhabit a very different world than all kinds of other people.
Agreed, and I do think that's really a challenge. I mean, would you expect that the best way to go forward here is to make sure that at each scale of the operation, there's an evaluative process. And then I guess that's not enough. You need to be able to evaluate across scales as well to make sure that you're delivering the best way that we can.
So one of the innovative things that a person had done who was to me a pioneer in health insurance, he has opened a Facebook account for this health insurance and encouraged everyone to just feed back information. So in other words, at the headquarters, he had all kinds of information, and what he did is he had people in his office liking especially very humble stories. And this was his way, of telling people, here I am, this big bureaucrat at the center. I care about your story. And when people saw that he liked the stories, others would post similar stories. And this is how he actually got a whole pool. And then he had, obviously, a whole media analysis group that would see, are there any patterns in it? Are there patterns in what typically come as stories, which are key problems we need to pay attention to? So what happened is that, with every year that they were renewing the software, they could then, program some workarounds for problems that typically, occurred in places. So this was one way of doing maybe something like citizen science, where you actually harvest, what people can tell you in order for your learning. You don't need to send anyone out there. People can tell you if you, have the capability of paying attention.
No, I think it's, I actually am recognizing how important it is to have people like you focusing on this dynamic, right? I mean, I think we have much to learn about that dynamic, right?
This is what I'm trying to say, that it's a case study approach, so it's not a statistical approach, because it's not about averaging. This is important, and it has a certain, a role to play in theorizing, but the case study approach allows you to, go through the network. So you walk around in the network and try to see what all is in the network. Where's the World Bank in this? Where's the kind of national politics? How, do political players at the state level, at the local level, who is the promoter at the village level? Who actually educates people? What is the technical training they get? Who is motivated? How is incentives are being paid to different people? And so if you kind of go through the entire network, it's almost as if you're telling the story of the whole world. Obviously I'm exaggerating here, but I think you know what I mean. It reaches you, into all kinds of different corners. You're right too. Why is a housewife motivated to learn a certain tool? Because her boy at the school is getting, the scholarship through this e-governance project, and then she needs to learn how to do e-banking, and she suddenly is motivated because it's for her boy's education. So this is what we do, when we do case study approach.
Right. So I guess the other thing that I'm wondering, as you're talking about e-governance, that's a huge body of information that probably has a lot of things in it that we can't even imagine, right? And I guess the question is, how can we best utilize that information? And I can think of nefarious ways in which it can be used, but how can we best use that information for the good of humanity, right? I mean, it seems to me that having that kind of information allows you to see this particular part of the country. There seems to be a disorder that's emerging much more frequently there than somewhere else. And if we have that kind of tracking information, it can be huge in terms of helping people. Do you feel like we're making the most of that we're really, recognizing all that's in there and that can be put to, effective use for a number of different things?
I think here, David, one could maybe, speak about the benefit of the Max Planck Institute, because as you know, we are working in bigger teams. And, as you can imagine, such a project, one fully understands it only if one has someone who actually knows IT, someone who actually understands health financing, and by doing this, we are also learning something about how different type of people need to communicate in order to make the best. So in other words, we obviously can't analyze everything, but by analyzing it and showing, how we use expertise from different fields in order to, speak about these processes, we can create images and imaginaries about, how this can be done and how we can encourage people to talk to each other, outside the usual crew they would talk to. Policymakers like to talk to policymakers. Techies like to talk to techies. But what if we learn, how to bridge this, what is in academia, we call this interdisciplinary communication. Out there, it's kind of intersectorial or inter-hierarchical or interclass. And at least unless, we learn, how to kind of produce these kind of conversations, we cannot make the best, because the best means to pay attention to what several people would say about what is best from their standpoint.
Yeah, and I can't help but wondering, how does the Indian government feel about them being used as this model system? I mean, have you gotten any feedback on that?
So I have kind of worked with policymakers at every level in India, and I actually get very good feedback in when we take this relationship seriously. I never go in there thinking like I'm the better policymaker. I understand India better than anyone in India. That's not a very good approach. But I'm organizing it as a conversation in which I ask critical questions and thereby make people reflect on their own world. So I remember this one day when I was with a health worker from the ministry on the road and asked him, "Can you show me how this works?" And he said, "Okay, I'll take you on a trip." And we went on a 2-day trip to many hospitals, so many hospitals the whole day. And every hospital thought, "Oh, this bureaucrat is coming. Let us tell him, all the things that don't work." So I had 2 days of complete demonstration of the things that don't work. And then the interesting thing was, at the end, we went in the car. We were both tired and dusty and hungry. And he said, "Whew, they have all these problems, and I can't solve all of them. And usually, I only select those that are actually solvable." And then he stopped in his own tracks and said, "You know what? I just realized why I'm paying attention to some problems and not to others. I was just doing this intuitively, but now I know how I'm doing it, and now we can be smarter about, see, this is solvable, this is not solvable, this is easily solvable, this is not, this is kind of more difficult to solve." So in other words, he had learned something about his own work by me, kind of just probing him and asking him. And so it was not really me producing that knowledge alone, but it was kind of a co-produced sense of, reflection on the system. And in this sense, if you work collaboratively and, see yourself as part of that communication, then people appreciate your presence.
Absolutely. And that is a beautiful story of discovery, right? I mean, basically, that came out of your interaction with him, and he made a discovery about how he's approaching things that he wants to change. And, I love trying to get people to understand that a large part of what we do as scientists is, seeing something and recognizing that we really hadn't understood something, we didn't appreciate something, then you can dive into it, right? It's that moment where you have the experience where suddenly you go, "Oh, whoa, I never thought of it that way." And this person had that experience with you, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So, well, I think we probably have to say goodbye here. But Ursula, thank you so much. It was wonderful seeing what you're up to. I have to say, as a neuroscientist, I'm a little lost when it comes to the sociology side of this and whatnot. But you did such a wonderful job of making that accessible. We really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for giving me this opportunity. And it was a wonderful conversation. And I agree. We are in this for the discovery. And it's such an amazing kind of way of being in the world.
Agreed. Super.
Thanks for watching Curiosity Meets Discovery, research talks from inside the Max Planck Society. Visit mpfi.org to sign up for updates. Follow us on social media at NPF Neuro. Curiosity Meets Discovery was produced by the Max Planck Institute for Neuroscience.